a little bit about Lumina and what we do as an American large national private foundation and how the impact investing work fits into our broader mission. So let me start there with this question about the big picture. So the easiest way to think about Lumina Foundation is that we're the largest foundation, private foundation in the US, solely focused on this space of post-high school education and training, the learning enterprise after high school. We are an endowed foundation as a private foundation, which means we don't raise money. That is hard for people to understand, that there are no new capital flows. All of our revenue is derived from the endowment of resources that we have. We have in excess of $1 billion at Lumina Foundation. And so all of our public charitable purposes have to be derived from that endowment. We are working very specifically towards achieving a national goal for the United States, which is to have 60% of Americans achieve a high quality degree, certificate, or other post-high school credential by 2025, which goes back to the chart that you were referencing just a few minutes ago, which is that in that sphere right now, the US is below 50%. We have a decline in the hierarchy internationally compared to many of our international competitors, friends, collaborators, and competitors. And part of the reason for that, we think, is that there has been increasing and more focused investment in many of these other countries compared to what we've seen in the US. Now, the US has had a great deal of promise long-term in terms of its model. The US model is highly focused on improving equity, particularly for low-income, first-generation, and other populations. At Lumina Foundation, we believe that's extremely important, that as we try to increase post-high school attainment, that we actually put our thumb on the scale of equity, and in particular, equity related to economic and social justice. We think that's extremely important in terms of these efforts, because those minority, low-income, first-generation, and other underserved populations are our fastest growing populations in the United States. And so we do all of that as a private foundation in the ways that you would commonly think this is done. So we make grants to support NGOs and nonprofits that are doing this work. We're also a convener. We're also an organization that does a lot of work in public policy to try to influence broader public investment in this space. And one of the important tools in the toolbox, one of the more recent tools in the Lumina toolbox, is this idea of impact investment. And in particular, what I'll spend most of my time talking about today is Lumina Impact Ventures, where we are actually making direct investments in primarily early and seed stage companies that are working to develop solutions that will actually help increase attainment and help Lumina Foundation serve as a catalyst for the United States to get to this goal. So this issue that I mentioned about the equity imperative at Lumina Foundation is important to underscore, simply because it impacts everything that we do at Lumina Foundation. So equity isn't a sort of nice to have, it's a gotta have when it comes to Lumina Foundation's work. So whether it's our grants or our public policy work or our convening or impact investing, we put all of the work that we do at Lumina through this equity lens. So equity has one meaning in the finance world. In this case, it has to do with racial and economic justice. And in this context, we believe that this commitment to social equity, if you will, is the undercurrent that drives all of the work that we do at Lumina Foundation. Now, to give you some sense of this, today in the US, you can see that a little over a third of the students are adult students. A significant proportion of them work. In fact, 40% work full-time. And you can see that we serve a large number of adult students in the United States, which is not as typical as what you'd see in many other parts of the world. Almost half our students are those financially independent from their parents. Almost half are first-generation college goers, and about a quarter are actually parents. I did a piece a couple of years ago for the New York Times called College Kids with Kids, because in fact, a quarter of all college students in the US today have their own children. And so that's something that I think doesn't fit the mindset, the stereotype of who attends college in the United States today. So in our work at Lumina Foundation, we are trying to impact three distinct populations. We call them opportunity populations: the traditional age learners, those under the age of 25, The returning adult students, these are people who've actually gone but have nothing to show for it. They never actually completed any type of credential, a degree, a certificate, or other credential. Believe it or not, that's more than 30 million Americans in the United States today. So it's a substantial portion of the US population. And then there's that adult with no post-secondary education credential. These are people who've never attended any post-high school learning, a training program, a college or university, anything. That's more than 60 million Americans. So at Lumina Foundation, we are focused primarily on trying to increase attainment using these tools that I mentioned, the grant making and the convening and the public policy, et cetera. Our efforts around Lumina Impact Ventures are really designed to dramatically improve these pathways for those populations that I mentioned by actually expanding who we are as a private foundation, thinking about ourselves in a different way, by actually engaging private sector companies in trying to draw capital and create investment in companies that are working to try to achieve these social outcomes that we're trying to achieve at Lumina Foundation, increasing post-secondary attainment. So we're investing in these private sector companies in order to draw more capital, draw new knowledge about what actually works, and to help inject new ideas into the system, because that system hasn't changed very much in the last several decades. As I mentioned, much of the rest of the world is creating change and increasing attainment. The US has seen some increase in attainment, mostly in the last decade, but for most of the prior 3 decades had basically not moved at all in terms of its attainment. So this idea of trying to use the private sector to leverage this large-scale change is really really important. And our model at Lumina Foundation through Lumina Impact Ventures is through this direct investment strategy that I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, trying to build this network of entrepreneurs, leaders in the sector, as well as investors, to try to create more momentum, more scale momentum, to try to get to this goal. We've had an interesting sort of evolution at Lumina Foundation in terms of our journey in impact investing. We started out where many impact investors do start out, which is that in our case, we're a private endowment, so we dedicated a portion of our endowment to managers, fund managers, who are working in the space of education. And so we thought that was a useful way to begin that work. We still have about 2% of our endowment invested primarily in 4 managers that are working in this space. They are good managers, they're doing very important work, and in fact, we collaborate with those 4 managers on some of the deal flow for the direct investment that we're doing through Lumina Impact Ventures. So while we were happy with that model of impact investment, which is trying to invest in managers who are then investing in companies that are doing this work, we felt like we wanted to leverage more of our capital in order to be able to achieve even greater impact by doing direct investment. And so we next expanded our efforts to try to build some of that pipeline, primarily an investment in nonprofit models. In other words, to try to build more capacity in the sector, to get more entrepreneurs interested in this space, to actually build the pipeline of deals that would be possible to do more impact investment. We did that for a few years, and then in 2015, launched Lumina Impact Ventures, as I mentioned, to engage both in investing in individual companies, but also to continue to invest in these not-for-profits that are trying to build the space to create more opportunity to grow the number of people that are interested in this work. So, you know, if you look at the way that we approach impact investing, we've got this sort of 3-tiered approach to it. First and foremost, we want to achieve the social returns. That is that at Lumina Foundation, we have this mission, we have this goal that I mentioned. The impact investments have to be aligned with the social returns that we're trying to achieve through the rest of our work. At the same time, we're trying to generate business and financial returns. In other words, what we're trying to do is actually make sure that we invest in companies that have the opportunity to draw more capital, that allow for follow-on participation, that allow for collaboration between nonprofits and for-profits. And we're actually agnostic about the capital structure in these deals. So we'll do equity, we'll do mezzanine financing, we've done a little bit of debt, and we use lots of different investment tools in order to do that, though the primary tool that we use right now is what's called in the American parlance a program-related investment, a PRI, which is a sort of legally defined approach to ways in which private foundations can invest in private entities and not run afoul of American investment law in terms of meeting our private foundation legal standard. And we're also approaching our impact investing work by ensuring that there's a learning return. In other words, that we are investing heavily in learning from the impact investments in order to not only inform what we're going to do in future impact investments, but in fact inform the rest of the work in the foundation. So it is very much a holistic model. Our impact investment team does not sit on the side and do its own thing. It's highly integrated with the rest of the organization. And we see that learning return element is to be really important. At the end of the day, our goal is to maximize all three of those: the social returns, the financial and business returns, and the learning returns through the sort of optimal deal structure. So this approach, one way to think about this, I think, is to sort of think about the impact investment tools as a sort of continuum. One way to think about what private foundations have long done is we've made grants, and those grants are, you know, if you think about them from a sort of capital perspective, they're 100% capital loss, right? A grant is 100% capital loss, but it's a 100% focus on impact, right? So the idea of making a grant is that you're trying to achieve your social outcome by investing in an entity, but you have 100% of capital loss. You make the grant, you never see the money back. On the other end of this continuum is these investments that we as a private foundation use to generate the returns to meet our mission obligations, to do what we're supposed to do as a private foundation. Historically, those have been completely returns focused and completely agnostic when it comes to impact. So impact investment lives somewhere in the in-between those two, both these program-related investments, which are mission focused, which you know, are returns agnostic, meaning that we'd like to see a return, but we're not highly focused on whether or not there's a return, to the mission aligned, which is more market rate or closer to market rate investments. So the mission related have tended to be more of the ones that we've done. This is not a sort of hard and fast rule of the investment in the fund managers that I mentioned earlier in the earlier stage of our development, whereas these mission focused with the more returns agnostic approach has been the more recent work that we've done through the PRIs. So both we see as important, both the PRIs and the MRIs, as tools in our approach to impact investment. Again, the bottom line though is that for us, mission impact is the primary outcome. So mission always trumps financial return when it comes to our approach to this. We have a fairly detailed process that I probably won't walk you through right now about how we approach our investment process, but it's a rigorous process of initial review of the companies that we've deal sourced in order to do a full level of diligence, actually get to the deal approval, and then we do a very close amount of monitoring and ongoing review with the entrepreneurs. That includes both follow-up with our investment team, but also with Lumina's internal evaluation and impact staff. Because again, and I'll talk about this in a moment, what we're trying to achieve through our impact investments is aligned. It is the same as what we're trying to achieve with the rest of our work as a private foundation, which means we want to make sure that they are learning the same things we are learning from the rest of our work as we are learning from the impact investments to apply it to the grants and the other parts of the work that we're doing. It's very much a two-way street. So as we've tried to build our portfolio since 2015, we've now invested in a total of 11 companies which you see at the top of this graphic here, as well as we've invested in the bottom part here in these nonprofits that are either trying to do field building, sector building strategies, trying to create more of an entrepreneur pipeline, or they're trying to provide field support in some way to directly work with the investment universe to grow this space. It's very important to us as we look at the companies that we want to invest in that we see high strategic alignment. That's a very important part of what we're trying to achieve with our impact investing work. We want to make sure that it is a highly committed and strong management team. Keep in mind here that these are all early in seed stage. Many of these are people who don't have a lot of management experience, and part of what we try to do is provide support to them in order to help them grow their companies. They often have a good idea but don't have a lot of management experience, so trying to make sure they have a strong management team and building in their ongoing work by inviting them to seminars, involving them in some of our direct technical assistance work, et cetera, is really important. We invest in companies that are developing scalable models. By that, I mean that we need to make sure that these companies are not designing a unique, highly stylized product that's going to serve a small number of people. Our whole intent here is to achieve societal impact. So all of the entrepreneurs have to be run through this screen of ensuring that, in fact, their company is a scalable model that can have a broad impact. And I'll talk about this in a little bit later. We want to make sure that there's a relatively low degree of capital intensity early in the deal here. We just don't have the bandwidth for large-scale investment. That's not the approach that we're taking here. And so, if somebody's looking for a high degree, a large investment early out, we're probably not the right place to do that. We're trying to help these places get going and give them the pathway to long-term growth through the various stages of their growth. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that they have a strong learning return. So far to date, we've invested a little over $11 million since 2015 in those 11 companies that I mentioned. And in fact, on the next slide, which is you'll see here in a second, you can see, oh wait, that's one, yeah, that one. You can see that most of our investments have been around the $1 million level, plus or minus, in these various companies. And some of these companies are now fairly advanced in their development. Our first investment, actually, Credly, which is this online platform for aggregating and managing digital badges and credentials, is actually maturing very well as a company. This is a fastly growing space because there are more and more credentialing entities creating more and more opportunities for people to learn and to gain some sort of acknowledgement for the learning that they're doing. Credly provides this platform that we think is one of the most innovative out there and has done really well. One of our more recent investments, Care Academy, you can see on the list here, which is essentially tackling one of the largest markets there are in the US today, which is the market for home health care. Because of the aging of the American population, home health care is a rapidly growing business. So trying to do online training for what is mostly a low-income immigrant population that are working in the home health care field in the US, providing them with tools for self-sufficiency through knowledge growth and development by actually getting credentials is hugely important. And we have companies doing lots of other things that maybe we can talk about a little later on. I want to mention here just quickly on the next slide that there really is this strong alignment between what we are trying to do in terms of our broader work as a private foundation and what we are investing in these first 11 companies that we've invested in. So this chart here is actually a chart that we use for all of our work at Lumina Foundation. So these priorities for action, the things that you see along the left edge of the graphic here, are the priorities for all of our work at Lumina Foundation. So every grant that we make, every convening that we hold, every investment that we make has to be focused on one of these 5 priorities for action. They also have to be focused focused on, since our efforts at Lumina Foundation are essentially quantitative in nature, by that I mean we're trying to get to this 60% goal by 2025, it means that we have a very specific population metric we're trying to achieve. And we've targeted that around these 3 opportunity populations that I mentioned earlier. So each of our grant investments, whatever it may be, has to be designed to increase the number of traditional age students that have post-secondary credentials in each of these numbers. And that holds true as well for our impact investments. So each of these companies is actually producing metrics showing how many people they're serving in each of these categories. And whether they're focused on the first or the third or the fifth priority for action, it's important for us in our diligence process and in our post-investment evaluation that we see that they are actually serving more and more people that fit our investment and strategic priorities. And you can see on this penultimate slide here, the next one, that in fact, these learners by demographics you see on the right here are actually actual numbers, thousands of people that have been served by these 11 companies, and some key demographic indicators, age and race being the 2 prominent ones. We have data on some of the other factors as well. But you can see we're serving a large proportion of these sort of underserved populations, the adult learners, the people of color, immigrants, et cetera. That's an important part of what we're trying to leverage with our work in impact investing. In fact, and I failed to mention earlier something really important, which is that we even use this equity lens to actually think about how we can grow the space of impact investing. So of the 11 companies that we have right now, 5 are headed by people of color. The CEOs are people of color, 4 are women. And so we've made these equity priorities real in terms of who's leading the companies, as well as what the impact is that they're trying to achieve in terms of their work. And not to be underemphasized, however, is that we do think that leveraging of capital is really, really important. And so we've increased our capital leverage multiple over time as we've gotten deeper into this. We're drawing more and more capital. The easiest way to describe this is that more and more investors are interested in these kind of companies because they see both the social and the financial returns as something worth investing in. So, I'll just sort of end with some quick observations about what we've learned from our work. Obviously, when it comes to our partnership with those co-investors that I mentioned, we want to make sure that we're not only leveraging their capital, but that they are in turn leveraging our tools and leveraging our network. In other words, we want to make sure that the investees are actually not only getting more investment from other investors, but actually learning from what we are doing as a catalytic organization working nationally in this space, and leveraging our network, the network of other investors, but also the network of all of the partners and organizations and NGOs and groups that we're working with, because that will help them be more successful in the work that they're doing. And finally, we have learned some things in terms of our work through Lumina Impact Ventures that we think are important. Some of these are questions that came up earlier in the advanced questions that people asked for this webinar. We think there's real value in an advisory board seat for lots of reasons. The primary one, though, being what I mentioned earlier, which is that we can provide guidance to management teams which have good ideas, but maybe don't have enough of the management expertise, help them build their core strengths while at the same time developing more of those networks. We have learned that at times our social outcomes focus can be a tension with some of the entrepreneurs. We are very serious about those metrics that we talked about a few minutes ago. And there are times in which that social outcomes focus has gotten us to the sort of 11th hour on some of these deals, and then the entrepreneurs are not willing to commit. We can't make an investment unless they commit to those social outcomes, so we won't make that investment at the end of the day. So that's been really important. If there's a downside to being a private foundation, it is that the pace of decision making can be slower than is optimal for some of these deals. These are people who tend to have big ideas and they want to go fast. We have diligence requirements that we're legally obligated to undertake, and these can take more time than sometimes the entrepreneurs are willing to wait for. That can be a little bit of a tension. Finally, I think these last 2 points are related, which is that this field of impact investing, which you've done such a terrific job of sort of leading this global conversation on, Gail, in the last few years, it means a lot of different things to different people. And this is part of both the promise, but also the peril, I think, of impact investing, is that before you know it, everyone thinks they're doing impact investing, but nobody actually understands what the other person is talking about. And we've seen that in our little slice of this world in terms of the work that we're doing. But at the end of the day, we are convinced at Lumina Foundation, this is not just the next cool thing. We think that this a model of impact investing is here to stay, and we are convinced that growing this sector could be a very important part of what we can help stimulate as a private foundation, both in our US context, but also hopefully around the world.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to go to your questions. And, I have a few of my own too, which is the concept of de-risking, philanthropic resources being used to de-risk. And it's a question that we often get in class. So what do you do? Will foundations give to private companies?
Yeah.
And if I'm in Asia or if I'm, in Latin America, with my philanthropic resources, can I in fact do that? Now, clearly that requires understanding law, but why did Lumina feel it was so important to de-risk and really invest in private companies?
My own background personally is I'm an entrepreneur, and so I'm someone who's been a social entrepreneur most of my career before I came into philanthropy. And one of the things that always frustrated me, frankly, as someone who was trying to work with private foundations, is that private foundations, I think, have the largest capacity to take risk of any social and any societal entity, and yet they're often afraid to take that risk. They're afraid to take that risk sometimes for good reason, which is that there may be donors or other influencers that can influence it. But by and large, when you are like Lumina Foundation, you are endowed, you have no additional capital inflows. You should have a great tolerance for risk. And so we see our approach as taking first risk, taking the highest risk when it comes to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve socially. So whether that's through our grant investments or through the other work that we're doing, or through our impact investments, we think de-risking the approach to the investment is really important. So when we saw the opportunity to leverage private capital to achieve our social goals, we said, let's figure out how we can do that. And we went through that journey that I mentioned earlier of focusing on fund managers to now making these direct investments. Both are very important and useful strategies, but I think long term, this direct investment model has a high degree of potential return for us, because I'm convinced that the risk that we are taking is going to grow the sector and actually create a lot more investment, a lot more opportunity to achieve the kind of social outcomes that we want to achieve. And from my vantage point, that is really our highest and best use when it comes to our role as a private foundation.
No, I think that's great. We've got some fabulous questions that came in prior to the webinar. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about those. And I think, Bruno asked a really provocative question, which is, do you see real impact investment and fake opportunity impact investing? And what's the little impact in reality? How do we begin to discern what are really good deals and what are portrayed in the field as fake opportunities or really not that worth investing in?
Yeah, this is a very important question, and one that we are grappling with at Lumina Foundation. There is a little bit of a gold rush that's going on right now, which is that, and I don't impugn anyone's intent here, but there are times in which I think people are talking about impact investment and they're a little bit interested in impact and a lot interested in return. And I think if you want to be focused on impact investing, you've got to understand that there are these valuable competing tensions between social return and financial return that you've got to stay focused on when it comes to this work. And so sniffing out the fake opportunities from the real opportunities is getting more challenging, because everyone is talking about this approach to impact investing and how important it is. Now, we've seen this very recently in the US when it's come to the conversation about opportunity zones, and this, we think, large flow of capital that's coming through the creation of these opportunity funds that are essentially redirected capital from capital gains taxes that under federal law can now be used to invest in these opportunity zones in these very low-income communities in the US. I think that the diligence that's required is what's really important. The US Impact Investing Alliance recently released a framework for these kind of investments in opportunity zones, but I think more broadly, that sort of transparent model of understanding what's expected of the impact investors, what's expected of the fund managers, and what the social returns really should be that we're trying to measure when it comes to impact investing should be something that the private equity markets, the philanthropic sector, and others should all be talking about together with a high degree of precision over time. I don't think that it should stall our efforts to create more opportunities for impact investing. But I think it means that we've got to have more diligence on making sure that we actually continue the conversation about what real impact looks like in order to make sure that this really is achieving the social returns that we want to achieve.
I think that's great. And I think that, again, speaking honestly and having transparency in the field is so important. So let's go on to Martin's question, which is really, what's the role of government to actually provide a quality education for all students versus the private sector? How does one balance government versus private sector, and where does impact investing fit?
This is the age-old question that we've debated around the world for several decades now about what's the optimum mix of public versus private investment, in part because we've debated for many decades public versus private benefit and what the benefits are of investment in education and training. From my vantage point, I actually think the tension is a good thing. Because I think that I'm a believer in large-scale public investment as an important part of what we should try to achieve, not only in the case of the work that I'm doing right now at Lumina Foundation in the US context, but also in the prior parts of my career where I was working on these issues around the world, thinking about how we can leverage all types of investment, public and private, around these common goals is really important. I think that we've seen a deceleration of interest in the public sector of investment at a time when the demands for talent are rising globally. That's unfortunate, because I'm not sure that the private sector is well situated to meet that demand over a long period of time. But I do think that the whole reason why we're doing impact investing at Lumina Foundation is that we believe the capacity of private capital markets, more than $200 trillion, is something that could be tapped to a degree that's largely untapped in order to build the talent base that we have globally and create greater opportunities for people to become more successful in work and in life through education and through a higher level of talent. But I will say that we can't use this increasing interest in private sector investment as a zero-sum game. In other words, we don't want to see deceleration of public investment as we're seeing acceleration of private investment. The point is that in order to grow the talent base that we have globally, we actually have to increase the investment on both sides. That's what's really required in order to achieve the social returns that we want to achieve as a global society.
And we've got some additional questions coming in too. Steve, do you want to ask those?
Yeah, sure. So we've got the questions on the screen now. We've got a couple of extra ones as well. Let me get back to the top of here. So with regards to Lumina Ventures, this is a question from Colin, who's online. What is the deal origination process? So in South Africa, I see a fair amount of available impact capital, but the bottleneck appears to be quality sustainable targets. What is the Lumina House view on target readiness programs?
Yeah, so in the beginning, as there's sort of an interesting history, there was a relatively small deal flow. There was not a lot of entrepreneurs interested in this space. As the conversation about ESG broadly has grown, and in particular as education has grown as a sector of interest from the impact or from the investing world, I think we've seen increasing interest in these issues. What's hard to know in terms of the deal flow is exactly, sort of goes back to the prior question, which is, how do you tell the people who are really interested in the social impact versus those who are just seeing this as a different way to make money? Making money is fine. Again, I want to underscore that I do think you can do well and do good. I think those things are not mutually exclusive, but the primary interest has to be in the social return. And so our diligence process at the beginning is really to have a sort of fairly detailed conversation with these management teams about what are the social outcomes that they've thought about and what are the social goals that they want to achieve through the products and services that they're providing with their companies. And even if they can't articulate that in the way that we talk about it, we learn a lot in the conversations with them about understanding exactly how they see the world and what they see as the sort of social good that they could do with their company as an indicator. And then we can help steer them. We can provide them with these tools to become more precise, more specific about what they're trying to do.
Fantastic.
Okay, related to that, so a question from Aslak Felin. So how does the KPI definition process look like to quality assure the outcomes? Is there a proof of evidence for social outcomes? How do you measure impact, I guess, is the shorthand?
There is, and in fact, if you're really interested in the sort of macro model at Lumina Foundation to social impact, you can look at the Lumina Foundation website, luminafoundation.org, and look at our high sort of a degree of metrics orientation in terms of our work. So we produce, it used to be an annual report, but it's now an ongoing, it's updated on a real-time basis effort called A Stronger Nation. And the Stronger Nation effort is actually a series of metrics that are both the indicators that will influence whether or not attainment increases and the actual attainment numbers in the United States for post-high school learning. And those metrics are metrics that we are tracking and following very carefully. We run all of our investments through these screens that I mentioned earlier about whether or not they are impacting these priorities for action or impacting those three opportunity populations that I mentioned. That's reflected in these Stronger Nation data. So we see impact in the purest form at Lumina Foundation as being about whether or not you are increasing post-secondary attainment, post-high school attainment. So that is the primary indicator. Now, we also think that it's important for people who actually have a post-high school credential to actually also have something that happens after that. So we're also measuring their economic outcomes as people who have a credential. And so we're starting to measure things like salary, employment, other sort of more financial and economic returns to learning over time as another element. So increasing attainment is one piece of it, but the economic returns that come from that credential are another piece that we're trying to measure. So both of those things we think are really important. At the end of the day, the reason that we want more people to get a high quality post-high school credential is not only to increase their economic capacity, but to increase their social output, their public contribution as well. And so we're measuring those kinds of things as well. You can see some of the data that's being collected by OECD, as well as other entities globally, is increasingly looking at these questions about voter participation, about whether or not people who have post-secondary credentials are contributing more civically and socially in their communities, et cetera. All of those things are really important to our work at Lumina Foundation around this effort to increase post-secondary attainment.
So thank you very much. We've had a couple of related questions, really. One from Tracy on the slide here, and another one from Sophie in advance that talk about, from your perspective, how do you think we can scale up impact investing or bring in more mainstream investors and mainstream capital into this space?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that that are really important, and these are part of the conversations that we've been having as I'm a member of the President's Council on Impact Investing and the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance. One important thing is for there to be ongoing dialogue between the philanthropic sector, which is trying to grow this space, and the true private capital world, which is that we need lots and lots of information sharing and transparency. We need to talk more about some of these frameworks in terms of transparency and outcomes that I talked about. That's really important. At the same time, we have to demonstrate that impact investment actually leads to some financial return for the investors. I think many investors around the world are interested in doing more than simply generating pure financial return. But they do want to know that they're going to get some financial return, even if it's at a less than a market rate, if they can be assured that there are social outcomes that are being achieved. And so I think that we've got to make sure that we emphasize this duality of the social returns and the financial returns in these conversations, and increasing the dialogue between the philanthropic and private capital market sectors is really important. The other thing that I think we need to do is we need to do probably a better job of educating government about how impact investment can be a large-scale sort of coordinated or complementary effort to what government's trying to do to provide broader social supports. In some cases, governments have been resistant to impact investing. In other cases, they've seen it as that zero-sum game I've mentioned earlier, which is that, well, if the private sector stepping in, we can step back. I think that's the wrong approach. I think that government's got to understand that if we're all rowing in the same direction, we can achieve the long-sought but little achieved outcomes that we've had globally of public-private partnership that are part of the promise, I think, of impact investing.
I think that idea of, again, some of the questions that come up in our class, 8 years of impact for impact investing, which is really exciting. But again, how do you get traction in companies for whom this is very different? You've got money managers who really weren't trained in social change or social outputs or impacts. And so you're actually asking a company to do something very different culturally. How do you make a major shift with your own money managers, or did you have to, in terms of doing your own due diligence and education about this is what social indicators are, this is how you need to incorporate into your own business, just as you're educating public sector? So how do you approach both your own money managers and advice that you have for our students and our colleagues on this webinar?
It's an ongoing process, to be clear. I think it's a really important point. And by the way, what you are doing here as an illustration of what I think learning institutions around the globe are trying to do is really important, which is you're trying to provide the people who are then going to become the business leaders, the people who some of them will become these fund managers, et cetera, the values that they have long term. But in the nearer term, I think what we need to be doing is actually spending more time in that conversation that I mentioned. So we hold an annual symposium at Lumina Foundation where we actually bring the investment community, the education community, and the entrepreneurs all together to talk about these issues. And it started as a very small meeting and has grown very quickly because there's more and more of this sort of deal flow conversation. The investors are really interested in understanding the changes in the sector and how the sector of education and learning is changing, but they're also trying to understand how they can meet their fiduciary obligations as investment managers while also achieving the social outcomes. So, we've tried to do our part as one entity in this space. In the philanthropic sector, we're fairly large. In private capital markets, we're a blip with $1 billion in endowment. but leveraging our role as a catalyst for large-scale social change, convening people is one really important way that we've tried to do that.
I think that's great. Time for one more question, Steve?
Yeah, so a question that has come in from Giri, which is that millennials will soon be inheriting the largest part of wealth on a global basis. How do you think that this might change the way that people and millennials in particular consider their investments in the future?
Yeah, so I've been working for probably longer than I'd like to admit, but approaching 40 years of work, and this idea of intergenerational wealth transfer, I think, has been a part of the conversation since I started as an analyst in my early 20s. And I have to say that with each generation that comes along, the increasing interest in social outcome is palpable. We have seen more and more interest in achieving these social outcomes, whether it's the millennials or the Gen Ys or the Gen Zs or whatever comes next. I think that what we need to come to agreement on is that, in fact, this is not about the intergenerational transfer of wealth. It's about our shared goals as different generations trying to achieve broader impact in society. And so, yes, maybe there is some handoff from one generation to the next, but the reality is that as more and more of this wealth gets transferred, the wealth that's been created in the last several decades gets transferred to that next generation is going to have a bunch of ideas that the current generations haven't thought of, and they should be able to grow that as well. The point is that this intergenerational wealth transfer is really intergenerational collaboration, and that's the point that I think we've got to underscore.
Well, I think this idea of collaboration, we've talked about the fact that government needs to be educated and brought together with the private sector, with philanthropy, and that blended capital approach really centers on, in many ways, leadership. And as a leader in the field, we want to give you an opportunity to give us your one last point of wisdom to leave with our colleagues in the context of leadership. How important is it, as you as a CEO for 27 years in various organizations, what's a germane point you'd like to leave our participants with?
Yeah, I think that I've had good fortune to be able to lead different types of organizations over the course of my career. And from my vantage point, I think that not enough people aspire to leadership. And I think it's really important that I do not consider myself unique or atypical. I've had a lot of drive in my career. Maybe that's my immigrant roots. I'm not sure what it's derived from, but to me, leadership requires people willing to step up and take a chance. The risk that you take as an individual is the same kind of risk that I hope private foundations will take more of, which is taking the first risk with this idea, not that it's better for you, but that it's better for lots of people, that it's better for all of us as a society. And in the end, you'll probably benefit from that as well.
That's fantastic. We'll turn it over to Steve to talk about how you can become a part of our community.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to say that, sorry, we haven't had a chance to get through all the questions today, so thank you for those people who have sent in questions. We've also had a few comments of thanks to you, Jamie, as well, for your inspirational work, so passing that on behalf of the audience, so thank you for that, and your time today. Sophie, I think we've addressed most of those questions as we've gone through. Really to say that we have 3 overlapping executive programs in this space. The original one, and I guess we've been speaking a lot about impact investing today, is the Oxford Impact Investing Program. That program is coming up in about 3 weeks' time in March, so that one is fully subscribed at this point, but we are opening applications for next year, so please do consider that for next spring. In the summer, we have our Oxford Impact Measurement Program. So obviously, this is always a key topic and theme which runs throughout any conversation to do with impact investing, in particular, broader through ESG, as that is getting more and more in common parlance and getting increasingly mainstream, but also through corporate work and social change. So how do you, what is your theory of change, and how are you demonstrating to yourself, to your investees, to your investors, to your partners that actually progress is being made? And finally, in November, we have our social finance program, again directed by Gail Peterson here today in partnership with Professor Alex Nichols at the Skoll Centre here at Oxford. And this program is looking at how to blend larger pools of capital to attack and approach some of the wicked problems in the world today. So largely talked about in current parlance in terms of the UN SDGs, but if these were problems that we could solve, then they would be solved by now. They're systematic problems. If we're going to make work towards them, we need a systematic change in how we allocate capital to them. So that is the focus of the program. So how we blend capital from public money and governments, from foundations, from private investments, from impact investing, and from elsewhere to make some progress towards some of those SDGs and big goals. I want to thank Gail Peterson today for hosting our webinar and bringing in Jamie Merisotis from the Lumina Foundation. Thank you, Jamie, again for your time today. Any final words, Gail?
No, I'll look forward to seeing our colleagues in one of our programs.
Yeah, so thank you as well out there for dialing in. We've had a good level of engagement on the webinar today, so thank you for your time there. Hope to see you again on the next one here or at one of our programs or events related to the programs. Thank you very much. Goodbye.